One of the consequences of the pandemic has been that governments have been increasing their debt at an alarming rate. So in this video, we'll look at those debt dynamics and we'll see what determines whether debt is rising out of control or whether it's sustainable. We'll look at the US and the UK, but we'll also take a global perspective, and we'll also look at a theory called MMT, which suggests that deficits are actually a good thing. Now, if you do want to keep abreast of economics and how it affects your portfolio, then why not sign up to our free weekly market roundup? There'll be a link below me in the description and above me. So now let's look at government debt in a bit more detail. This is not a recommendation. If you want advice tailored to your specific circumstances, seek independent financial advice. Let's start off by looking at how big those global debt markets actually are. In 2009, the size of global debt markets was about $81 trillion. As with any global financial market, the US dominates, making up about 40% of the global market, with the European Union coming second and Japan third. 9 years later, in 2018, the size of that market had increased to over $100 trillion. And the majority of the growth was in emerging markets, with a relative increase in size of 10%. And that came primarily at the cost of the EU, which shrank as a proportion by 9%. And although almost all of the market commentary that you see is about the equity market, that's quite a bit smaller than the global bond market. So equities are about 75 trillion and bond markets are about 100 trillion. To get an idea of the size of that market in something you can visualize, if we were to compress that $100 trillion in the form of dollar bills into an asteroid, or you could call that a cashtroid, its radius would be about 560 meters. Here's the Statue of Liberty on that cashtroid, and here is the Empire State Building. If we look at capital markets in the US, which in 2018 were about $86 trillion, equities make up about a half of that, and then in the bond market, three components dominate. And that's US Treasuries, which are government bonds which are loans to the US government, mortgage-related securities, which are used to fund the US real estate market, and corporate bonds, which are loans to US companies. When we look at the size of any market, we usually compare it to the income of the country, which is measured using its gross domestic product. To see why that's the case, imagine that you had personally a debt of $100,000. If your income is $200,000, the debt-to-income ratio is quite small. It's about half of your income. So you could quite realistically pay off that debt over some period of time. Whereas if your income is $25,000, that same debt would be 4 times your income. And in fact, you may not even be able to pay that money back unless your income increases. If we look at data from 2018 before this crisis and look at government debt divided by GDP, the largest debt for a developed market country is by far Japan's, at around 200% of GDP. So for every 1 yen which it produces in goods and services, it owes 2 yen to its bondholders. If we look at how those debt to GDP ratios change over time, you can see Japan here in orange. And since 1990, that ratio has been increasing rapidly until it reached about 200% in 2018. Italy's debt to GDP is also high, and the US and UK before this crisis were well below 100%. So for those who think a debt to GDP ratio which is very high is a sign of imminent disaster, Japan's the one example which shows that simply isn't true. Japan can carry on issuing debt, there's still a brisk demand for that debt, and although economic growth hasn't been amazing in Japan, it certainly hasn't been catastrophic, and they haven't seen huge runaway inflation. In fact, they've seen quite the opposite. Now let's look at the impact of the crisis on that debt. A key thing to understand is how a government balances its books. If this block represents expenditure, then a government will try and balance that expenditure by generating income through taxes. But if it doesn't have enough income to balance it, then it issues government debt in order to balance its books. Now, because of the crisis, governments have had to step in to help their economy, either through spending, and the most popular way of doing that is to transfer liquidity to support firms, but also to provide wage subsidies for people who've been temporarily laid off. And there have also been revenue measures. So, for example, they've allowed companies to defer their tax, and they've allowed the same thing for households. But of course that all costs money, and if we look at the size of those measures relative to GDP, there's a huge disparity in the size of those measures, with Germany, Italy, Japan and the UK leading the rest of the countries in terms of their generosity, and these countries on the left doing far less. And as a consequence, if we look at the government debt in 2009, you can see that it increased rapidly. And that's because of similar measures to stimulate the economy due to the recession following the global financial crisis. But what you can see in 2020 is a far bigger response. And the fiscal balance, which is the expenditure minus the income, turned sharply negative in 2009, and it has again in 2020, but by a much larger degree. So these stimulus measures have certainly come at a very great cost. And that naturally begs the question, is the increase in debt sustainable? So let's imagine that we start with a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. For this imaginary country, their debt is $10 trillion and the country's income, which is generated from all of its goods and services in 1 year, is $10 trillion too. And that's how we arrive at the 100%. But how will this vary over time? If both the debt and the GDP increase by 10% in a given year, then the ratio doesn't change at all. So if the GDP growth equals the debt growth, that means that the debt to GDP ratio will remain stable. But if the GDP growth is greater than the debt growth, in this case the debt has grown by 5%, whereas the GDP has grown by 10%, then the debt to GDP ratio will fall. If we look at the UK over a very long period of time, all the way back to 1920, you can see the debt to GDP ratio and how it varies with this line. Notice how after the Second World War, the debt to GDP ratio spiked up to 250%. But following the war, GDP grew more quickly than the debt, and so the debt to GDP ratio gradually fell. It did take a long time, but eventually it fell to less than 50%. Now obviously in this crisis that's going to spike again, but as long as the UK returns to growth at a rate which is greater than the growth of debt, then we can reduce the debt to GDP ratio again, just like we did after the Second World War. The US Treasury has a monthly report which shows how much money it's spending, and during 2019 you can see that the breakdown shows a roughly $300 to $400 billion expenditure month by month. There's a similar pattern in 2020 until we reach April and May, when there's a significant increase in order to pay for those stimulus measures. In this diagram we can see how much the government earns on the left-hand side. Those are the total receipts, which came to $174 billion in May. And then the money that the government spent was $573 billion. And the difference between the two was the deficit, which was just under $400 billion. So if we look at how the debt changes year to year, there are 4 factors we have to consider. One factor is this starting level of debt. Now the government pays interests on its loans just like you or I, so that has to be added to the overall debt, and so we also have to consider the interest rate that you pay on the debt. Now of course rates at the moment are very low, so that debt servicing cost is fairly low. If we look at that interest expense over time, you can see it's gradually increasing, and that's because the amount of US debt has gradually been increasing over time, such that in 2019, the interest payments were about $700 billion. And the final factor is the primary balance. That's the difference between the amount of money the government spends and its income, which is primarily through taxes. You can see that the debt servicing cost is fairly small as a proportion of the total amount which the government spent in 2019. It makes up about 8% of government spending. But if we break down US expenditure by department, you can see that almost all of the categories are increasing over time, and the primary balance has been a deficit, and the government's had to plug the difference by increasing its outstanding debt. The government tax revenue has been increasing as GDP increased, but it's been growing more slowly than spending. Another interesting thing is if you look at the amount of money paid by corporations in corporation tax, it's much smaller than the contribution to the government's income from individuals. So the onus of tax falls very clearly on US citizens and not on US companies. So let's take 2019 as an example. The government generated $3.5 trillion in revenue and it spent $4.4 trillion, which meant that its deficit was just under $1 trillion. And that's why the outstanding US debt increased between 2018 and 2019. So by living beyond its means, America has effectively been putting more money on its credit card. But as a proportion of its income, you can see that the debt to GDP ratio really increased during and just after the Great Recession. But even before the crisis, US debt was unsustainable because the US was consistently spending more than it earned in taxes. Now, some people don't think that's a problem at all, and one theory that supports that view is called modern monetary theory, or MMT. When Theresa May was Prime Minister, she was on the BBC programme Question Time, and a nurse in the audience complained that her salary hadn't increased for over a decade. Her response was to say that she'd be honest, and that the government would put more money into the National Health Service, but there isn't a magic money tree that we can shake that suddenly provides for everything that people want. Notice that the initials of Magic Money Tree are MMT, which is what some people jokingly say MMT stands for. When this crisis hit, it turned out that many of the countries which said they didn't have a magic money tree actually did, and they managed to shake it and release large amounts of money. Proponents of MMT say that this isn't a problem. They say that the government can never become insolvent, and that's because of the simple fact that it can create money. And that's true of many developed market economies, such as the UK, the US, and Japan. Secondly, they say that money creation is only constrained by inflation, not insolvency. If the government prints too much money, there's always a risk that it stokes inflation. If that does happen, the government can increase taxation and cut government spending in order to keep inflation under control. Now, while this does apply to some countries, such as the United States, which are very wealthy, other countries which have tried to go down this path, such as Zimbabwe, did lead themselves into a path of hyperinflation. So while it can't be universally applied, it certainly does describe what's happened to debt, both during the global financial crisis and in the coronavirus crisis. Governments have massively increased the amount of money which they've created, but that hasn't stoked inflation. And in fact, I've done a whole video about why that might be the case. And I would recommend this essay by Yakov Fagin and Dominic Loisda, called The Class Politics of the Dollar System. The article is actually about how the US can overcome something called Dutch disease, but what's really interesting about its point of view is that it sees the deficit not as a problem, but as a public resource, rather like a country which finds itself on rich oil fields, such as Norway. And similarly, proponents of MMT think of a deficit as a positive for the US economy, because any money which is issued by the government and which isn't returned in the form of tax is then deposited with the private sector, which stimulates the economy. Now, when it comes to debt sustainability, the cops in the United States are called the US Congressional Budget Office, and their job is to provide an objective and politically neutral view on whether US debt is sustainable. And they publish this on their website in a very clear and well-articulated format. So here they're showing the debt to GDP ratio since 1790. One thing which always increases debt to GDP and which is very expensive is a war. Starting with the Civil War in the United States in the 1860s, then we had another spike with World War I and with the Great Depression and with World War II. But just as with the UK, the US grew out of that debt problem. After the global financial crisis, debt spiked again, and this projection was before the coronavirus crisis. And it's very clear that according to their estimates, debt to GDP was projected to increase in an uncontrollable manner. They're also careful to point out that those projections are very sensitive to their assumptions. For example, if productivity, which drives GDP growth, is shifted up or down by 0.5%, then by 2049 it can make a massive difference. So if the economy grows faster, debt to GDP is roughly stable. Similarly, because the debt servicing cost depends on the interest rate, if interest rates are higher, then that pushes up debt to GDP. Whereas a 1% fall in interest rates means that debt to GDP becomes sustainable. The CBO updated its economic outlook based on the coronavirus crisis in July 2020, and what they're expecting is a very sharp fall in GDP in 2020, a fall of -6% in fact, which is far larger than the global financial crisis. But then in 2021, they expect growth to jump massively to around 5%. Then in subsequent years, it falls back to its previous level of growth, which is just over 2%. However, if we look at their unemployment forecast, they think it'll spike in 2020, but then it takes a very long time. This is 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And even after 5 years, it doesn't fall to the level of unemployment that we saw before the crisis, which was below 4%. So it does look as if the CBO is forecasting quite a bit of scarring on the economy. There's an equivalent body in the UK called the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, or the OBR, and they point out that government tax payments fell dramatically. They were down 43% due to the coronavirus. And at the same time, government spending increased by 48%. And that combination made the primary balance deeply negative. And they think it's increased debt to GDP above 100% for the first time since the early 1960s. The amount of money that the government has to borrow is shown in 2019, month by month, with this yellow line. Just in April and May, you can see that the government's had to borrow far more in order to pay for things such as the payment protection programs, which it rolled out very quickly. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has also produced a projection on what's going to happen to the UK economy. And even in their faster recovery scenario, you can see that it takes several years for the UK to return to trend growth as it was before the crisis. And if we get a second wave, the impact is much deeper and much longer lasting. What's interesting is that the public sector net borrowing, which is due to the primary balance going into deficit, is broken down into two components. One of them is a direct cost of new policy measures, and another one is due to reduced activity in the economy due to consumer behavior changes. And it's the economic environment and that behavioral aspect which is much longer lasting and which produces the long-term drag on the UK's finances. And looking at the debt to GDP projections, if we get a second wave, that would push the ratio eventually above 110%. While their central case is that debt to GDP will increase above 90% and then steadily increase up to 100% by 2025. So according to this forecast, it could take many years to pay down that debt to GDP ratio. But my primary worries are not about developed market economies. I'm much more concerned about emerging market debt following this crisis. Moody's Investment Service put out a report saying that non-investment grade emerging market and frontier market sovereigns are going to face a sharp economic downturn following coronavirus, with recovery taking 2 years or more. If we look at the breakdown by region, you can see that LATAM is the one which has the lowest growth forecast. On average, they say that growth is going to fall by 7% for emerging markets, and the countries which will be particularly hard hit are the ones which depend on tourism for income, but also those that depend on commodity exports. But there are many countries which fall into this category of having sub-investment grade credit ratings of BA1 or below. The IMF has come up with a similar warning where it shows that for low-income developing countries, they expect the interest-to-tax ratio to increase very dramatically in 2020. So in other words, the cost of paying interest for those low-income countries is going to absorb a very large proportion of their tax income. So the debt impact will be much greater than developed markets, where that ratio is much closer to 10%. And the two countries which they name as being problematic are Nigeria and Zambia. So while developed markets have taken on a huge amount of debt, they can probably grow their way out of that and reduce their debt to GDP ratios over time. But in emerging markets, that could take much longer, and it could eventually lead to a sovereign default. So because interest rates are very low in developed markets, that's a very low bar to beat in terms of GDP growth to grow your way out of this very high debt to GDP ratio that we find currently. So I'm not particularly worried about developed markets, but I am worried about some poorer countries and whether they're going to be able to grow out of this crisis or whether it's going to lead to sovereign debt defaults over the long term. So if you enjoyed that video and you want to learn more about investing and you want to support us, then why not go to patreon.com. You can see the link above me here, and join us. It costs just $10 a month. You get to join us on Slack, which is the chat application you can see beside me here, where you can chat to me and other members of the community. Plus you get access to our live webinars where you can ask questions of me and I try to answer them as best I can. And here are the 2 latest contributions to our growing library of Patreon only video content. And along with the video replay for that library of content, you also get notes so you can research things in more detail yourself. So if you do want to support us, you'll see the Patreon link over on the far side of the page. Just click on that and you can join us for $10 a month. And as always, thank you for listening.